All right, welcome to another video on sociology. And in this video, we're going to cover global stratification and inequality. And having said that, let's just jump right in. So, the first thing I want to bring into this consideration is some material that I left off in talking about the economy. And when we talk about the economy in sociology, we have to talk about it holistically. You can't understand local level dynamics without understanding regional and statewide and even nationwide and even international dynamics relative to the local. And you can't understand the global economy without looking at the economy at the local level, state, national, because all of this goes together. And so in this slide here, we also have economic activity, primary, secondary, and tertiary. And part of what I'm going to do in this presentation is begin to draw some of the connections with all of this globally. And I have some additional material that kind of highlights this, like case study demonstration of the economy, the global economy. But I wanted to call attention to this as we begin here. So, primary, secondary, tertiary. Yep, there we go. And so there's a set of slides here that date back several years. And this is the more recent one that I want us to focus on. This is from 2020, I believe. Yeah, from 2020. And these pie charts we've looked at before in our chapter on social class. Those were for the United States, and this is global. So this is global income and global wealth. And remember, income makes up wealth. Wealth includes income. Wealth includes income and property, anything of economic value, um, um, investments, property, etc. So it's broken out each pie by 20%, quintiles. And as we could clearly see on the surface, these are not equal pieces of a pie. So if there was equality in terms of global income or global wealth, then all of these would be the same size, the same dimensions. Of course, we know that there is an exaggeration, a consolidation of global income with the top richest. And then over here, I want to draw attention, as I did before, these really low numbers here. So we've got the richest 20% of the global population. This is the remaining 80%. And really, we're talking about 20, 40, 60% of the global population accounts for basically zero wealth. So when we look at these, excuse me, when we look at these dynamics in terms of the United States, yeah, we know that there's a gap between upper class, middle class, lower class. And when we look at this globally, that gap between, upper, middle, and lower, if you want to think about it, is a little bit different. Because when we think about global poverty, we're talking about life threatening poverty. When we're talking about that bottom, the lower class, if you will, that is a very different category substantively compared to lower class in a developed nation. So when we talk about the global poor, we're talking about people living almost in absolute poverty to some extent here. So we're going to look at some of those dynamics in this presentation. So when we talk about global development, global stratification, there's been a switch or a shift in how the global community talks about development. I'm including here the historical look at that three worlds model: first world, second world, and third world. And you'll still hear people use these terminologies. But we moved away from that as a global community and talking now more so high, middle, and low income. And as an example as to why, when you look at the industrialization model, when we look at societies that are civilized and most developed, they've passed through industrialization. And that's been of great benefit to them, their lifestyles, their quality of life, lifespan, everything associated with development. That's, positive. But there's also some downsides of development that is tied to industrialization. For example, global warming. So if you put this in context, if most of the world's population is middle class or lower, or is a middle income society, I should say, and lower, then a sizable portion of our planet is not industrialized. And so if we still have that model that if you industrialize, that's the path towards, you know, development and high quality life and all of that. But that comes with the consequences. And as much and as significant as global warming is now, you could see that we can't continue down a path because it's not sustainable. We can't continue down the path of industrialization because it's not sustainable. What do we mean by sustainability? Something that can occur over time. And we're talking about now thinking about economic activity in a way that's sustainable to the environment. And so that is why we move into that high income, middle income, low income. And more, we're seeing the global community trying to move to promoting development and economic activity that is sustainable. And that's a challenge. That is a really, really big challenge. Okay. So when we look around the world, high, middle, and low income countries, this is, you know, generally the strata of the three major areas in the world. And let's look at that in a little bit more detail. So high income countries largely are above the equator. They're in the northern hemisphere. They cover 65% of the Earth's land area and house about 3.6 billion people, about 4 billion people, about half of what the global population is now. Okay. They enjoy 64% of the world's income, though. So you can start to see that you got about half of the people on the planet account for most of the income, more than most of the income. And they cover a large part of the land area. So a majority of the population lives on less than half of the land space. So we start to think about density, and that's relevant, especially as we think about places that are not developed, that don't have the type of sanitary conditions that developed areas do, that breed disease. That's where density comes into play. There are significant cultural differences across these countries. Some speak English, some speak Spanish, French, German, but they have very similar economic conditions, very similar. And that kind of starts to get us to thinking about what is the economic connection between high, middle, and low income countries. And we'll talk about that with some case study examples um, in other videos. So we've talked about production, distribution, and consumption. That's what we mean by the economy. Production in high income countries, as you can see here, capital intensive and leading to service oriented. So capital intensive is based on lots of resources, some of those financial resources, but capital intensive here also means big machinery and advanced technology. So the other end of the spectrum here of capital intensive is labor intensive. Labor intensive is a lot of human labor going into economic activity. It's not that there's not a lot of human labor going into economic activity in high income countries, but the difference is with the addition of advanced technology. In a previous video, we looked at changes in employment in agriculture, and that has dropped tremendously in the United States in the last 100 years. Not many people are working in agriculture, yet we're producing more food because we have advanced machinery to do the work of 100 people, if you will. Okay? So, but think about advanced machinery, big machinery, advanced technology across economic activity, whether it's primary sector, advanced machinery in the secondary sector, and advanced machinery and information technology in the tertiary sector. Okay? High income countries. Next, we're going to look at where these are located, and not just those places, but generally where middle and low income societies. And I've mentioned in previous videos that Central Africa is one of the poorest areas of the world, along with Southeast Asia, and that's what we mean over here. Okay, some of these are up for debate. Russia, and what has occurred in the last few years with war in Ukraine, that they may not be considered a high income country anymore. So things can fluctuate a little bit as cultural events change. Middle income societies. So try not to think about middle income societies like middle class. Middle income countries have some characteristics of developed areas and some characteristics of very poor places. So, for example, in the capitals of these countries, for example, Mexico City in Mexico is very developed and it looks like a US city to some extent, right? But you get a little bit outside of the major area of the city and you have people living in extreme poverty, living in some cases on dirt floors with no electricity and poor sanitation. So, middle income country doesn't really suggest middle income development. It's kind of a mix of some rich and some very poor, right? They span 20% of the Earth's land area, about 3.2 billion people. There's that densely populated. Some of the biggest growth in population around the world is occurring in middle income societies. And we'll talk about that a little bit in the last chapter. So, about half of people live in the cities, about half live in rural areas. And as you can see, that last bullet point is sort of draws attention to what that means. Low income countries, they're largely agrarian, which means agricultural. 15% of the Earth's land area, under a billion people. There's been a lot of advances in addressing basic health needs of people in low income countries. There's been a lot of advance in the last 20 years. Still densely populated, live in villages and farms. Very limited industrial technology, but look here where it says follows cultural norms or follows cultural traditions. It's not always that these places are poor because they don't have technology. Remember, this is Central Africa and Southeast Asia. These are some of the oldest civilizations on the planet. They've been around the longest. And so they're deeply rooted in their ways of life. And frankly, they may not be that susceptible to change. So this brings in the terminology of ethnocentrism. You know, sometimes in developed nations, we look at poor places and we think, man, we need to fix those places. They're not like us. They need to be better. Of course, that's an ethnocentric attitude. So who's to say that with all the problems we have in developed countries, that those other places should change to be like us? So there's a lot of interesting dynamics when you think about development, human rights, and how we navigate all of that in a ever expanding population around the world. Um, People's lives are often shaped by hunger, disease, and unsafe housing. It's difficult for people in rich nations to grasp the extent of human poverty and famine. I oftentimes like to have people um, think about this in terms of a calorie, right? So, what do I mean by that? So, a calorie is a unit of energy, and in the developed world, like the United States, we have pretty good access to calories, to food, right? Perhaps our relationship to calories is one where we have too many calories, and overweight, obesity, and problems associated with that are evident of overconsumption of food, right? In low income countries, their problem is getting access to calories. And it's not that they're not working enough and making enough money to get calories, it's that they don't get access to enough calories to do the kind of work because their cultural environments don't have a lot of resources. And so he said, well, why don't we just give all of the food that's going to waste in a rich nation to a poor nation? That's an interesting approach, and some of that has occurred on occasion. But that food goes away. It's not a constant thing that we do in rich nations of giving poor places food or resources or even machines to do well. If the culture doesn't adopt that and make changes, and if the cultures can't fix the tractor after the tractor is given to them, excuse me, if the culture doesn't have the things in place to fix the tractor after it's given to them, then the tractor is just going to fall apart and not be able to be used. So it's not just a matter of giving people resources; it's a matter of cultural change. Okay. Um, let's get to the more recent version of this slide, and here we go, right here. This is well, let me bring it up for you. This is high income countries, middle income countries, low income countries, and look at population share versus income share. Of course, you could see here most of the population is living in high and middle income countries, but there is a lot more income in high income countries than middle income countries. Of course, You can see here that a large population share and not anywhere close to the income that they need for the population. That is another example of global stratification. That's what it looks like in a graph form, in a table. There's relative poverty and absolute poverty. And I kind of spoke to this about the nutrition just a moment ago. So we've talked about this early on when we looked at what is stratification and what is inequality. Stratification is universal. Anywhere that people live together, you're going to have stratification. And so that means that we're always going to have some people with fewer resources than other people. That's relative poverty. That's people in poverty relative to the cultural standards of the area, of the civilization. Absolute poverty is lack of resources that is life threatening. So we're talking about food, water, shelter, basic health care. And so these are two different things. You have relative poverty in every society, but you don't have absolute poverty in every society. It doesn't mean you don't have people that have that lack resources. You do, but we're talking about large scale general cultural patterns. So you may have pockets of extreme poverty in developed areas, but those pockets that are in developed areas are widespread and just part of the overall culture in areas that are the poorest in the world. Okay. So why does global poverty exist? So if we knew the answer to this question, we wouldn't have global poverty. But it's a complicated thing, and I've kind of addressed some of these already. Lack of technology is one reason why global poverty exists. Some of these poor places are relying on human labor, and people can only do so much. The, you know, when they have advanced technology and the technology can do the work of people, can be more efficient and be able to produce more. But again, it's an issue of how do you maintain and sustain that in those cultures if you don't have a repair shop or a mechanic or those kinds of things in place culturally. Population growth. So population growth is a lot in poor places. And in the developed world, population growth does not happen near as fast as the developing world. So in the developing world, it's already poor, and you have a lot of people being born. It's kind of hard to keep up. In the chapter on urbanization and population, in the last, I think the last chapter of the semester, I'm going to look at some of those dynamics. In some cases, you've got most of the population 10 years of age and younger. And when we look at development, in order to maintain development in an area, you need most of the population to be of their prime working years of 20 to 50. So population growth is a big part of this. I've already spoken a little bit to cultural patterns. Gender inequality is a really interesting factor. When you look at civilization and development, there's really one factor that you can look at that's going to tell you a lot about a place, and that's the role of women in the society. Is it the women's job to stay home and birth kids and take care of kids and that? Or is it a mix of that and also integrating into the workforce and making money? One strategy, frankly, of promoting development and addressing population growth issues is getting women integrated in society, changing the gender roles of women. So there's not just about birthing a lot of kids. So if they're integrated in society, they can't have as many kids, and that affects population growth. So, there's some religious connotations in there, and sometimes that is at play in poor places. A reluctance for contraception, for example. And again, we're talking about Central Africa, Southeast Asia primarily, where they have traditions and cultural patterns that have been around for thousands of years in some cases. The last item on here is global power relationships. Well, how did rich nations get rich? Part of that's at the expense of poorer places. That's called colonialism. The more recent version of that is neocolonialism, and it involves the influence of multinational corporations. And so in global economies, we think about how corporations can use populations all across the planet to produce, distribute, manufacture goods and services. That's an advantage to the corporations. Okay. And you're going to watch a couple of videos that kind of illustrate some of that. later on. Let's look at this idea of colonialism. We can look at the continent of Africa, and you can see historically the European powers that were involved in the continent of Africa. That's colonialism. They go in and get whatever resources they want, whether it's natural resources or human resources, people. That's slave trade involving the western part of Africa, how that began. But they go into these places and they create culture and get people dependent upon those things. And then when they got what they want, they up and leave. And then, countries and people struggle because they don't have the kind of economic diversification that they need in order to sustain their way of life. So that's an example of colonialism and looking at the continent of Africa. So I'm going to stop right there because I'm going to get into that material a little bit later in looking at some videos. And that's going to wrap up this section on global stratification. So thanks for your attention, and see you soon.